think we're live. Hey guys, welcome to episode number 10 of the Vervaeke Watch Party. Just gotta make sure everything's set up here. The way we do this is we watch the episode, then we do the discussion afterwards. We'll take like a 10 to 15 minute break, intermission. You guys can, get set up. We're live. Hey guys, welcome to episode number 10 of the Vervaeke Watch. All right. So and I will give the link for the discussion afterwards, and then we're good to go. So see you in a bit. Oh yeah, by the way, the show notes for this episode will be at futurethinkers.org/meaningcrisisnotes.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And last time we were talking more about mindfulness and trying to get an account of how mindfulness can bring about an insight, not just a single insight, but into a single problem, but a modal insight, a systematic insight that is fully transformative of the agent and arena relationship and bring about the alleviation of existential distress and the affordance of enhanced meaning. And we took a look at that by getting into the machinery of attention and seeing that attention involves two kinds of attentional scaling. Attention involves an ability to engage in a transparency opacity shift and also breaking up gestalts into features, scaling down, the kind of thing we can enhance in meditation. But it also involves an ability to scale up, to move from featural to gestalt, and to go from looking at something to looking more deeply into reality. And that in mindfulness, in meditation, we're practicing the scaling down to break inappropriate framing and scaling up to train making better framing. And that if we can optimize by learning how to fluently flow between the two, bringing in an aspect of fluency and flow that we've already talked about, then we could optimize our capacity for much more comprehensive insight, and we could take it, if we could take it to the depths of ourself, like we do in the pure consciousness event, and the depths of reality and the resonant at one-ment, if we could integrate those, optimize between them, we could bring about prajna, a kind of non-duality that would be potentially transformative of the whole agent-arena relationship, dissipate modal confusion, enhance meaning in life by bringing about one of the most powerful kinds of mystical experience, give people a sense of enhanced realness that will challenge, encourage, and empower them to transform all of their existence and bring about a tremendous increase in meaning in life. Talked about some recent cognitive science, including some of my own theoretical and experimental work that seems to be supporting the claim that these higher states of consciousness can bring about these quantum changes, these radical kinds of transformative experience. So today I want to talk about that. I want to talk about transformative experience and the pivotal and really brilliant work of L.A. Paul on the notion of transformative experience. But before I do that, we have to step back and talk a little bit about altered states of consciousness. We have to talk a little bit about what we mean by an altered state of consciousness, what we mean by this kind of transformation. And that gets us into one of the most difficult problems. David Chalmers famously called it the hard problem of consciousness. Arthur Schopenhauer called it the world knot. Trying to explain consciousness is like trying to explain God. Right? It is one of the hardest problems. I'm not going to endeavor to do all of that, although I'm going to try and make use of some of the work that myself and Anderson Todd and Richard Wu have put into trying to understand at least some of the important functions and properties of consciousness and why altered states of consciousness can be so affording of radical transformative experience. So one way to do this is to look at two sort of questions we can ask ourselves. One is, what is consciousness? How does something like consciousness emerge out of the brain? That's sort of the nature of consciousness. And a lot of people are doing a lot of work on that. And then we can also ask questions about what's the function of consciousness? What does consciousness do? Those aren't the same question, because you may be surprised to hear that we don't have a consensus on what consciousness does. Most people know that consciousness is a mystery, but most people don't realize that what consciousness does is also a mystery. I mean, think about it this way. You love your consciousness. You identify with it. You don't just, and you don't know your consciousness the way you know other things. You know your consciousness by being conscious. Like if I ask you if you're conscious right now, you are. How did you do that? You just are conscious, and you know that you're conscious. Knowing and being, remember Aristotle conformity, right, are the same. You participate in your consciousness. But and what would you give it up for? What if I said to you, you could have unlimited power and wealth, all you have to sacrifice is any consciousness of it? Would you take the deal? Of course not. But what does it do? Well, you say, well, no, it's not obvious, because you can do, and you do most of your things without consciousness. I have no understanding, no conscious awareness, I should say, I have some scientific understanding. I have no conscious awareness of what my brain is doing that is allowing me to generate speech. Do you? You don't. This complex, sophisticated thing that we still can't get artificial intelligence to do well, it's happening almost completely unconsciously. What's my consciousness for? What does it do? So, two really important questions. How does something as mysterious and strange arise out of matter? That's the nature question. And what does it do? Again, I am not going to presume or dare to try and answer these comprehensively. I don't need that for what we're doing here, because I'm not trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness. I'm trying to solve the hard problem of meaning. One hard problem at a time, please. But what I want to do is show you how a convergence of work, that some of the best work that's being done on consciousness, points towards something that will tell us why altered states of consciousness can be so valuable to us. So one of the best accounts for the function of consciousness is called the global workspace theory. So the idea is that your consciousness functions very much like the desktop of your computer. So here's the idea. You have your desktop, and then you have all your files, right? And what you can do is you can activate a file. You can bring that information into the desktop, and you can activate this file and bring it into the desktop. And then these pieces of information can interact with each other, and then you can broadcast back to any or all or just one file the changes you brought about. That's how your desktop works. That's how you use it. Well, what's the analogy? The analogy is, here's all of your unconscious processing in your brain, and what you do is you retrieve it, bring it into a space, something like working memory. You activate it so that the pieces of information can interact with each other, and then you broadcast it back, right, to any and all of the existing files. Why do you want to do that? Why do you do it on your computer? Well, you don't want all of your files active at the same time, because that's a disaster. You want to be able, and notice what's going on here, you want to be able to select certain pieces of information that are relevant, bring them together, transform them in a way that's relevant, and then broadcast the changes back that are needed. So the global workspace theory says this is, and it's gaining a lot of empirical evidence to support it, says this is what consciousness is functioning to do. Now this is very general. So more specifically, and so this theory is associated with Bars, and then there was a paper by Bars, Shanahan and Bars, that more specifically try to answer the question about, yeah, but why this machinery? Barr's also published an attempt to answer that question more specifically in the Cambridge Handbook of Consciousness. What it comes down to is the idea that what this architecture is helping to do is to solve a problem that's called the frame problem. Now, I'm going to talk much later in specifically what the frame problem is, so put a pin in it, we're going to come back to it. But the basic idea here is, right, what this is doing is helping you to zero in on relevant information. And that's very, very important, because there are sort of three areas in which this is a huge issue. One is all of the information that's available to me right now. We're going to have to talk about this later, but technically, mathematically, the amount of information that's available in this room is astronomically vast. And I can't make use of all of it. I get overwhelmed by it. So part of what I have to do is select out of all of that information what information I'm going to make use of. I also have a huge amount of information in my memory. Overwhelming, it's vast, and the possible ways it could be connected. I have to select from some of that. And then I have to put those pieces of information together. And all the ways I can put together the information from out there and the information about here, also vast and overwhelming. Later on, I'm going to give you mathematical arguments about this. Right now, I just need you to get it intuitively. So what consciousness is doing, right, is it's helping these problems. It's helping you zero in on the relevant information. The relevant information from out there, the relevant information from in here, and the relevant information that will help put those pieces of information together for you in the way that it's needed. Just like you do that. You do that with your computer. You search through your memory. You select what's relevant. You bring it onto the desktop. You put it together in a relevant manner, right? And then you use it in a relevant way. But we can't use a homuncular explanation. There's no little man running inside. What's doing all of that in a self-organizing fashion is your consciousness. This helps to explain why consciousness is so tightly associated with working memory, and working memory is so tightly associated with intelligence. Okay, so the core function of consciousness seems to be to help you realize, become aware of, actualize, put into action relevance, relevant information. We're going to come back to this in more depth. There's a more neuroscientific and psychological account by people like Bohr and Seth that say when we measure when people are conscious, it seems to correlate with certain kinds of brain activity. What kind of brain activity? The brain activity that seems to be involved when people are chunking information or when they are restructuring it, like an insight. I've already shown you this ability to manipulate attention, to afford insight. They're arguing that that's one of the key functions of consciousness. But what is all of that doing? It's the same thing, right? The Bohr and Seth model is basically saying the function of consciousness is to give you a dynamic improvement in your ability to zero in on relevant information. One of the most prominent theories of the nature of consciousness right now is Tononi's integrated information theory. Integrated information theory. Now, his theory is not about the function of consciousness, it's about the nature of consciousness. But of course, he's going to give a derived account of the function. What is consciousness according to him? It's how powerfully integrated pieces of information are. How much one piece of information in your brain is causally dependent on interacting and affecting other pieces of information in your brain. The more tightly the integration, the more powerful, right, the processing. And what he would say is the more likely that complex, as he calls it, because it's actually a complexification of information is going to be affording consciousness. But then when you ask them, well, why is consciousness, why? That might be what consciousness is. I think there's much more to consciousness, but for the sake of argument, that might be what consciousness is, but why is consciousness doing this massive complexification of information? So he actually proposes something like a Turing test for consciousness. He says you can test to see how conscious a system is by giving it anomalous pictures and figuring out if the pictures don't make good sense. Here's the idea. When I'm complexifying, when I'm doing this very dynamic integration of information, what that's tracking is how much I'm actually picking up on, right, the patterns in the world, making sense of the world. The reason why I'm doing this is precisely because I'm trying to, as best I can, track the complexity of the world. So, what's the main function? Well, the main function of the integrated information is to allow you to determine if pieces of information are relevant to each other and relevant to you. So, what consciousness seems to be, now, let's be careful what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that every instance of relevance realization is consciousness. What I'm arguing is that what consciousness seems to do is the following. It seems to be a way in which you can coordinate attention and other related abilities of awareness so as to optimize how insightfully you can make sense of your world. So that's why you need consciousness for complex situations that require insight, for situations and problems that have a high degree of novelty or challenge in them. It's why you can reduce consciousness when the problem has become very well defined for you, that doesn't have a high degree of novelty, it doesn't require insight. I don't know if this is a complete account of the function of consciousness, but it explains something we've already noted, that when you have an insight, what do you have? You have a flash. It's like you get a sudden brightening of consciousness. It explains why you might want to alter your state of consciousness. Because if I alter my state of consciousness, I'm going to alter what I'm finding relevant and how it is standing out for me, how it is salient for me. Let's put a lot of this stuff together, the machinery we had about attention, stuff we've talked about fluency, stuff we talked about salience, and notice a phenomena that Mason called sizing up, right? Part of what's happening, part of what consciousness is doing is it's creating a salience landscape for me. Now, what does that mean for me? Well, first of all, I'm picking out of all of the things, all of the things I could pick out, and when I say I don't mean me, I mean my consciousness. I'm picking out some features. You are not paying attention to every piece of information in this room. You can't. It's overwhelmingly vast. But you pick out on some. And then what you do also is you begin, so you've already selected and you start to prioritize it and you foreground some of it. So for example, presumably I'm foregrounded and what's around me is backgrounded. And of course, we've already seen it's going both ways. Remember that, right? And notice, again, what I'm looking at, what I'm looking through, and then I'm taking the features and I'm starting to foreground them, and then I'm going to gestalt those features. I'm going to figure. I'm going to create a figure. We use this language of figuring out. Figuring out. I'm making something, I'm making it stand out even more salient to me. and I'm also configuring it together. So all of the features, and then foregrounded, and then this is getting configured, right? Right, and this also is feeding back. And then, of course, I'm framing problems. I'm framing problems. We've been talking about that all through this series. So you've got a very complex dynamical system at work. So what's happening right now is your consciousness is creating a salience landscape. Some things are rising up, right, out of unintelligibility as features that are getting foregrounded and configured, and then you're framing problems around them, and then things are shifting, and your attention is shifting around. Other things are becoming more, and you've got this highly textured, highly flowing salience landscape. That's what it's like to be here right now. Now there's more going on, of course, right? So part of what I'm doing, I get this salience landscape, and my problem is around the cup. But I'm not quite sure what, so I move around it. I try to get into an optimal position. If I get too close, I lose too much of the gestalt. If I get too far away, right, I may see the whole thing, but I'm losing the details. I need to get to the right place where I can metaphorically and also literally in this sense get what Merleau-Ponty calls an optimal grip on it. So what I'm trying to do is I'm optimizing between gestalt and feature, between looking through and looking at. I'm optimizing within this whole sizing up. So I'm taking my salience landscape and I'm using it to get an optimal grip on things. Not maximal, and grip is meant here as a metaphor. It's meant for my contact, my interactional contact. How can we understand what this optimal grip is doing? Look, when I get the salience landscape and I adjust, an affordance opens up. Okay, what's an affordance? This goes back to Gibson, the idea of visual perception as this active process of landscaping. The cup is graspable to me. It's not a property of the cup per se because it's not graspable by a praying mantis. It's not a property just of my hand because, right, my hand alone can't grasp. An affordance is, right, setting up a relationship of coordination between the constraints in the thing and the constraints in my hand so that I can engage in an interaction. So it's a way of co-identifying. The cup is, this thing is, it's been salient to me. I've got now an optimal grip on it such that I can create affordances. So it is presenting itself to me and I am configuring myself to it. It is graspable by me. And this is Gibson's point. You don't see like colors and shapes. What you see are affordances. I see that this is walkable, that this is where I can place things, that this is movable. So, do you see? You get the basics. The salience landscape sort of gets you in contact. Then you start the optimal gripping, and the optimal gripping gets you into the creation of affordances, where basically the agent and the arena are being co-identified. I'm a grasper, and this is graspable. I am presenting myself to it, and it is presenting itself to me. So you have consciousness is setting up a salience landscape, but within this, you're doing this process of sizing up and that produces a presence landscape. You get a whole affordance network is laid out for you. But that's not enough. Remember we talked about with flow. You need to be able to track the differences between correlational patterns and causal patterns. As you interact with things, your brain is figuring out the causal patterns as opposed to the merely correlational. This is the depth landscape. This is your ability to figure out. You see kids doing this, right? You got the 2-year-old, and they got the spoon, and right, and what do they pick up the spoon, and they drop it on the floor. You pick it up, they pick it up, and they do this over and over again. Why are they doing that? Because they're trying to use their salience landscape to generate affordances. The spoon is graspable, it's throwable, it's droppable. But why do they repeatedly grasp and throw and drop? Because they're trying to figure out the causal patterns around the spoon. They're transforming the salience landscape into a presence landscape and that into a depth landscape. They're getting a deep kind of understanding, not in words, but interactionally, of the spoon. This is what consciousness is doing for you. It's doing it right now. It's laying out, right? It's all of this is a way in which consciousness is helping you zero in on relevant information. It's creating this textured salience landscape so that certain things stand out for you and other things don't as much. And it's constantly shifting dynamically. And then within that, it's creating a presence landscape of how you and what's salient are being co-identified, right? Coupled together into an array, agent and arena relationship. And then it's also affording you, and that's dynamic, because the affordances are constantly shifting. And then that's affording you tracking the causal patterns, getting into deeper contact with the guts of the world. That's what consciousness is doing. So if I were to transform my consciousness, I'm going to be transforming all of this machinery. I'm going to be transforming my salience landscape, my presence landscape, my depth landscape. The patterns I'm going to track, the kind of agent I can be, the kind of arena I can be in, are going to be radically transformed. And I won't have just a flash of insight like I do with a 9-dot problem. I will have a systematic. Look, an altered state of consciousness is not it's not an insight in consciousness. It's an insight of consciousness. It's a radical transformation of all of your landscapes, not just this particular problem. Look, I'll try and show you what I mean by this. By a systematic insight. So this goes back to childhood development, pivotal work of Piaget in psychology. And this is picking up again on one of the metaphors we were using. We use wisdom is like enlightenment, wisdom is like waking up, and here's another one. Wisdom, like as the child is to the adult is to the sage. Wisdom is like growing up. Okay, so you take a 4-year-old and you do this, you count out 5 candies, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You need a 4-year-old because they can count and they understand that 5 is more than 4, it's less than 6. You count it out, right? And then you count out 5 more candies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You show them that like this. And you say, which row do you want? And they reliably, and you've counted, they know there's 5 here, they know there's 5 here, but they confidently pick this row. And here's the thing, all the kids do it. And that mistake is related to a whole bunch of other kinds of mistakes they're making. They're not making just a single error. Look, this is what made Piaget a great scientist, why he's a pivotal figure in trying to understand development. And think about Aristotle and development. See, there had been lots of IQ testing way before Piaget. People have been testing kids' IQ for a while. And they had been throwing away the errors as garbage, because what you paid attention to was what the kid got right. Yeah, success and Protestant work ethic, yeah. Piaget had this insight, but wait. What if there's a pattern in the errors? If the errors are systematic and not random, then that would mean that there are constraints, remember constraints? There are constraints operating in the child's cognition. And maybe we could understand and think about Aristotle again and biology, because Piaget was, guess what? A biologist. Maybe we could understand development in terms of how those constraints are shifting and how they're shaping the kid's sensory motor interaction with the world. And what he found was, in fact, that the errors are systematic. All of the kids are making this kind of error, and they're making a whole bunch of related errors. There's a whole system of errors. And so that points to some underlying set of constraints. Now, what's going on? What's going on here? Why is the kid picking the lower row? Because it takes up more space. Think about everything we've talked about here. This variable is super salient to them. Their salience landscape is only picking up on that. Now, you, I hope, don't fall prey to this, because you're also picking up on another variable at the same time. You also make salient that the extra space is non-candy space, and therefore is what? Not relevant. But the kid doesn't pick up on that. Their salience landscape is not sizing that up. And so they don't have the same affordance as you. Now notice this. You see through this illusion because your salience landscape has been trained to pay attention to these multiple variables at the same time. The way you size things up, integrate them in attention, means you don't fall prey to this. Part of the way in which you become wiser than the child, you don't fall prey to self-deceptive illusion, is because you've trained your salience landscape to zero in on the relative information in the relevant way. Now, think about this. Remember we talked about salience and how when things are super salient to you, that triggers bullshitting and self-deception. If I could change my salience landscape, I don't fall prey to this. I don't fall prey to the illusion. And I won't act foolishly. Now, what I need you to understand is, here's a whole bunch of these errors that the kid is making. They form a system. And they all have to do with the fact that the salience landscape has not been sufficiently cultivated. So the kid might have an insight here, but it doesn't really matter because they're still going to be blocked in this problem and this problem and this problem. They're still going to be locked into a particular stage of development. But what if, and this is an idea that working out in conjunction with Jun-Sung Kim, what if you didn't have a single insight? What if you had a systematic insight, an insight that changed the whole system? It wasn't an insight in your consciousness. It was an insight of your consciousness. in which you're changing your salience landscaping, as opposed to just changing how you're framing a particular problem. That's what the child does when it develops. It actually changes its salience landscaping so that this whole system of errors falls away, and it starts to see through an illusion and into reality. Here's the thing you need to now think. You've heard me say it. You have trained your salience landscape so that you do not fall prey to the systematic illusions of the 4-year-old. Yes? Yes. But you know what? You're falling prey to a lot of systematic illusions you're not aware of, because you can only become aware of them if you can transform your salience landscape, your presence landscape, and your depth landscape to get in at what is actually most relevant systematically. Not here and here. All of us can have an insight here and here, but what is it to have a systematic improvement in insight? That's to be wise. When you have salience systematically tracking presence in depth so that you can wisely zero in on the relevant information and make your life more meaningful, that's your significance landscape. It protects you from bullshitting. It allows you to see through illusion and into reality, and it affords you having things more present to you. It would afford you to have a more comprehensive, flowing relationship with reality. Altered states of consciousness have this potential to create a insight of consciousness. Now, they also have the potential to do the opposite, right? They have the potential to screw up your salience landscaping and make yourself more prone to bullshit, more prone to self-deception. That's why most altered states of consciousness are rejected as being illusory and delusory. But why is it then that certain altered states of consciousness have the opposite? Why is it that certain altered states of consciousness feel like this? Like, wait, it all makes sense now. I'm seeing through illusion into reality in a way I haven't before. Why is that altered state more real, the really real, as Plato was fond of saying? And this everyday, is less real. Why do I feel like I woke up, that I became, right, an adult to my previous form that seemed to me like a child? What's going on? So let's set up the problem, because getting clear about the problem is half the battle. Formulating a problem well is much, much of the important work at trying to bring a solution to it. So we know that many people experience, as I've mentioned, these higher states of consciousness. And reliably, we'll talk about the phenomenological profile in a bit, but reliably, what is characteristic of these states is that people find them to be really real, and in both directions, arena and agent. They say, wow, that's the way the world really is, and they also say, this is who I really am. So much so that I'm going to transform my everyday experience so that it comes more consonant with that realness, that enhanced realness. So there's a mutual moreness, a mutual more realness that happens in these higher states of consciousness. And it's prescriptive. It demands change. It challenges people to change. It taps into those Platonic meta drives of getting your fullness of being, your real self, and getting the fullness of contact reality. It twitches those on, and you go, I need to have that. I'm willing to transform everything in order to get back to that really real world and that really real self. So I call this, so we have the higher states of consciousness. I call this the problem of the ontonormativity. Remember that ontology has to do with the structure of reality. Normative is when things are placing a demand on you to be better, to improve. So these higher states of consciousness are precisely experienced as higher because they're challenging you to change, because they're presenting you more realness. And they're triggering those Platonic meta drives. Now, as I mentioned, these states are historically important and they're pervasive. So you can read Taylor's book, Waking from Sleep. He has about 150 interviews. You can read many of he presents a lot of first-person narratives of these people in this experience. You can take a look at Newberg's book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. He did an online survey of 1,500 people in 2016. As I mentioned, there's just larger general surveys of how often people have these kinds of experiences, and they range in intensity, but it's around 30 to 40% of the population. So we have to take these experiences seriously. We know that from the work at the Griffiths Lab that what's happening in a subset of psychedelic experiences, so here's all the psychedelic experiences, you have a subset in which people have a mystical experience, and some of those people, the mystical experience is deeply transformative. It triggers that kind of quantum change. Okay, so why is the ontonormativity of higher states of consciousness problematic? Well, here's why. The transformative experience that people undergo, the radical transformations they're willing to make, seems to be driven and justified by this. Why are you doing this? I'm doing this because I had this experience and it was more real and I've got to stay in touch with more real. They justify this transformation. I mean, sorry, I don't mean to be reductive, and I'm not being disrespectful, but, you know, Buddhism and Taoism and Vedanta and the core of, you know, aspects of Judaism and the mystical traditions in Christianity and Islam come down to this claim: I had this, and it justifies what I'm telling you. It explains and motivates the changes that I underwent. But why is that problematic? Look, because it's, like I said, it's in contrast to how we treat most of our altered states of consciousness. We go into dreaming, we come back and we say that's not real. We go into these, we come back and say that was more real, and this is less real. Now, let me try and explicate this problem further. Look, why do you reject your dreaming as unreal? Why? Because when you're in the dream, it seems real. Because when you come out, that pattern, those things that happen in your dream, don't cohere with the rest of your life. You've got this overall coherent picture of your life. Intelligibility, remember Plato? This overall picture makes the most sense of the most of your experience, and if Plato's right, the more intelligible something is, the more real it is. This picture is more intelligible, it's more real. The dream is bizarre, it doesn't fit in, ergo, less real. So, realness is something like the pattern of intelligibility with the widest scope. Wide and rich coherence of content. It makes the most sense of the most of your experience. Puts together your beliefs and your memories, etc. But look what's happening in a higher state of consciousness. It's the exact reverse. You have this single experience. It doesn't cohere with the rest of your life because that's why it challenges the rest of your life. It doesn't cohere with the rest of the life. It tells you that the rest of this is illusory and you need to change it. In fact, the difference is so great that instead of rejecting it, you reject your everyday experience. So the thing that you use to reject the dream, so look at the picture. I use all of this and I reject the dream. And then I have the higher state of consciousness, again, a single thing, and I use this to reject all of this. What's going on? The higher state of consciousness is a temporary experience. It does not cohere with the rest of our experience. That's how and why it can challenge and demand such radical transformation of our everyday life, our everyday self. And here's what's even more, perplexing. It does this without providing any new intelligible content. These experiences are traditionally ineffable. You can't put it into words. They're traditionally trans-rational. You can't give any argument or explanation or justification. How is it that this temporary experience that you, why? What was it? Describe the experience. I can't describe it. Well, can you explain to me what? I can't explain it. So there's no content, it's temporary, and yet somehow it goes the exact opposite of most altered states of consciousness. These states, these so-called higher states, should be the ones we most reject. They're temporary, they challenge all of our intelligibility, coherence, they don't produce any viable explanation, any viable content, and yet we promote them as the really real and use them to reject our everyday experience. And that's the core of the axial revolution. This problem of the ontonormativity of higher states of consciousness goes to the heart of the axial revolution and the way it is still informing our very cognitive grammar and our existential ways of being right here, right now. That's the problem of the ontonormativity of higher states of consciousness. Now, we know that there's a possibility that altered states of consciousness can bring about a developmental improvement. But how? How do we tie this to this? Can we give an adequate enough explanation of these higher states of consciousness? And we need to do one that will help to explain why triggering them can be so transformative. Because here's the thing, Yaden's work shows people's lives do get better. They're not making it up. After they've had these higher states of consciousness, this encounter with the really real, their lives get better by all kinds of important measures of meaning, relationship, they get better. Okay, so what do we need? We have to solve this problem. We have to make some progress on it. Now, we need actually two explanations that need to be integrated together. First of all, I need a descriptive explanation. I need an account of the underlying processes, cognitive brain processes, we'll talk about this, that explain the phenomenological, the experiential nature of these states. Why do people, like when people describe what's happening in these states, why does it have the features it has? It has to explain why people feel it being more real, why it feels that it justifies, empowers, and motivates them to undergo transformative experience. But in addition to something that's a descriptive account, I needed a prescriptive account. I mean, the first account is going to be largely psychological. This is what's happening, and this is why people are experiencing the way they're experiencing it. That's descriptively adequate. But prescriptively adequate has to show me this. Is it actually a legitimate thing? Do these states actually provide a rational justification and a guide for the transformations that people are claiming on their behalf? Are these states actually philosophically justifiable? Or is their claim to ontonormativity all just an illusion? Is it rationally justifiable? Now, this prescriptive account must integrate with the mechanisms and processes of the descriptive account in order to be overall coherent, in order to give us the best explanation of how and why these states are operating. So the descriptive account, the best way to do this is to do a cognitive scientific approach. Now, at some point I'm going to teach you in this series how to do good cognitive science, but one of what we're doing in good cognitive science is we're plausibly trying to integrate different levels in our descriptive analysis. My descriptive account should give me a good account of the cognitive processes that are at work in the mind. It should give me a good account, and that's going to rely largely on psychology. It should also give me a good account of the information processes that are at work. That's going to rely on ideas drawn from artificial intelligence and machine learning, because that's the project when we're trying to most understand and optimize information processing. It should also draw on neuroscientific accounts of what's happening in the brain. I need an account that simultaneously elucidates each one of these, the cognitive mechanisms, the machine learning mechanisms, and the neurological mechanisms, and does that in an integrative, mutually informative fashion. I want a plausible integration. That's what I need for the good descriptive account. That's what I'm going to give. I'm going to try and argue how we can understand why these higher states of consciousness are the way they are in terms of both cognitive, in terms of all of those, the cognitive, the machine learning, and the neuroscientific level. After I'm doing that, I'm going to then endeavor to try and show you how those processes, the cognitive processes, the information processing processes, the neurological processes actually provide a rational justification for the transformation that the people undertake. But it's not the kind of justification you might be expecting. What I'm going to argue for is that it is not that these states provide us with any special knowledge, because these states are not about changing evidence, acquiring new evidence the way science. And we should not use these higher states of consciousness as a way of challenging our scientific claims. And many people will do this. But the mistake is to then think, well, that's it. That's the sum total. We've shown that these higher states of consciousness don't generate reliable kinds of knowledge, so we should reject them as irrational. No, because that's again to think that the whole point of your cognition and your rationality is to get better beliefs. And I've already been showing you through this series that there's much more to it. When the child no longer falls prey to the illusion, no new facts have been discovered. The child knew that there were 5 candies on top and below. No new facts. It's not like there's been a new scientific discoveries about space or candies. What changed? What changed is not knowledge. What changed was wisdom. The child has learned to see through illusion and into reality. And what I want to pursue with you is this idea that higher states of cognition are rational, not because they provide us with new knowledge. Look, people go into these states and they come out with exactly opposite conclusions. You can I've read so many of these reports. People go in and they have this higher state of consciousness and they say, oh, and I knew God. People go in, they have this higher state of consciousness, and I knew there was no God. Exactly the opposite. The content is diametrically opposite. People will say varied metaphysical claims. What's changing is not the content, not this or that piece of knowledge. What's changing is your functioning. You're not gaining knowledge, you're gaining wisdom. You're gaining skills and sensibilities and sensitivities of significance landscaping that radically transform your existential mode. That is why, for example, that the Buddha famously refused to answer metaphysical questions about nirvana, about enlightenment. Because that's not the point. That's not what this is about. This is not about getting supra-scientific knowledge. This is about getting extraordinary wisdom and transformation. We're going to take a look more at trying to answer the problem of higher states of consciousness next time, and we'll return also back to discussing more how the Buddha integrated that into trying to deal with some of the deepest problems that we face as entities that have to realize relevance, pursue salience, deal with existential anxiety, cultivate significance and meaning, try and overcome our illusions and delusions, and find a fullness of being and an optimal grip on the world. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, guys, we're going to take a 7.5 minute break, and then we'll come back and do the discussion. So if you're new to this, we do an open discussion. Anyone can join. You can join the waiting list right now. Usually we admit everyone by going to futurethinkers.org/discuss. So please do that right now if you want to join the video chat. And then I'll just let you in once the intermission is over. Anything else here? I think that's pretty much it. So we'll see you there. Again, the link is futurethinkers.org/discuss. Alrighty then. Let me let everybody in.
I think we're muted. All right.
Hey everyone.
Hey.
Hello, hello. How's it going, guys?
You all hear us all right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, all right. So anyone still just in the chat, I just want to remind you, if you want to get clarification on any of this stuff, like find out what's practical, ask questions, kind of prompt the group to explore. That's sort of what this is for. So you know, we're not looking for people to be leaders and
Or experts.
Yeah, or experts or anything. So don't be afraid of being dumb. And you can again come to this discussion at futurethinkers.org/discuss. So we can start it off here.
Does anyone have any burning thoughts that they want to start with?
Well,
David.
I knew I was going to pick on David.
Well, I'm picking on David actually because he said something in the chat that it feels very relevant for him right now. This discussion, that there's been a lot of things in the last week that have been coming up that seems like people have already watched this video.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I would say that the thing about it is similar to on the Future Thinkers group calls, that the sense that I'm watching my psyche spread across the screen in multiple perspectives of things that I've witnessed. It's like, wow, in some sense, I was actually talking to Alexander Prince this morning and talking about the 100th monkey effect. The fact that it seems like the deeper I get into these conversations, the more capable, willing, and eager others are to get involved in these conversations, even though they haven't witnessed this content, which surprises me. It's like, wow, this seems like this is coming alive in a way, and I think it's akin to Heather's insight cascades as well. I mean, it's in mine, and it's like people are coming to this in a way that there's an openness to something about the way that Vervaeke talks about this specifically, the kind of altered state of consciousness, which may be kind of a BS or seems like relevant, but may not be, and then the kind of altered state of consciousness which really does give a fuller sense of the landscape, what's happening here, what there's something relevant and salient about this awareness that does kind of awaken collective intelligence, sovereignty, and these notions in a way that even I think as bright as Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall are, they've had trouble really getting across in their discussions. It feels like Vervaeke does a really good job of making this happen, even though there aren't very many people that I know of who've heard of the Vervaeke talks.
I think he's done the best job of anyone I've ever heard of describing experiences that are a lot more common than the people who understand the language of these experiences. You know, if you've been paying attention, if you're kind of intellectual and paying attention to this stuff, if you've ever experimented with psychedelics, I mean, a lot of the insights he's covered so far can be experienced in very simple, I shouldn't say simple, but you can experience them, and then he describes them in very accurate and complex ways. But I find myself hearing a lot of this stuff for the first time and recognizing the experience in my past, especially with experimentation with psychedelics, but never having heard the language. I think this episode in particular was like that for me.
Yeah, the same here. There's something about the contextualization, the metaframing and language that he uses, which gives me handle on this, you know, where it shows me very clearly kind of the places where I got confused or off track a little bit. I mean, I think that where he ended up in this one specifically is you might have a very powerful altered state of consciousness, and people can come up with different conclusions. And if you believe the content of the conclusion, you're challenged. And there's something that over time you kind of realize that, oh wow, this is not about adding content. This isn't about truth in the metaphysical. This is about being able to perceive, changing the context that allows the content to be more salient, which is really, it's fascinating when you see that. And again, Alexander and I were talking this morning about the fact that that there's some way that one of the comments that we made that was interesting is, it would be really fascinating if I had had the kind of map that Vervaeke has when I started my meditation practice a while back. And I had the thought, and I wondered, is that true? Or would I have actually not had the capacity to understand it? It's sort of like, oh, if I understood sentence structure, then understanding the alphabet would have been a lot better.
Yeah.
One thing I find so interesting about this is it's the first time I've seen like something that approaches an explanation for how the kinds of things John Vervaeke is talking about, this awakening, intersects with trauma recovery. Because essentially when you do deep trauma work that actually accomplishes something, what you're doing is like really getting in there with your hands and changing your salience landscape. That's what you're doing, like one nut and bolt at a time. And so it's interesting, he's talking about a transcendent insight that changes your salience landscape. But actually, you can change your salience landscape gradually in a way that produces the transcendent insight, and do it backwards. And so I've never understood how those two relate. And I think he just links it up so beautifully, and I can kind of see the working parts and how they fit together now.
Can you expand on that a bit more? You can, the reversing?
I guess. So let me see here. I guess let's say if I'm starting from a point where I'm viewing the world through past trauma, and so things are salient to me that aren't necessarily relevant, and I go in and I do inner work and I deal with that trauma, and it makes the things that were salient are no longer salient. Now I can focus on what's relevant. And somehow that, like doing enough of that, is slowly bringing you closer and closer to perceiving reality, because you're not distracted by things that are salient but not relevant.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a conversation with someone yesterday that said, a friend who commented that it's kind of like we learn to do the inverse function. There's something of the getting to the point of actually having a sense of wisdom about it allows us to apply that into other domains. There's something of the recognition of, oh, I've got this trauma, I go through and experience it, I recognize there's some salience that I was missing. I now have an altered state of consciousness which remaps all of that. And at some point I want to say something. I'm gonna summarize this. It seems like I get a way of being, in a limited way, my own shaman, knowing how to explore other trauma in that same way. I learned how to sort of, oh yeah, wow, if I've done that here and here and here, I wonder about other traumas. Yes, here's this thing. Let me actually engage with that as well. This is the meta, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's something about your own discovery of the map of your own, like the map that's relevant to you, not to anyone else.
The map of your mind.
Yeah, allows you to find, kind of shine a light on all the dark corners and do all of that trauma work self-directed.
It's that point about the errors in a child's cognition being systematic. They're not random. And the errors in an adult's cognition are likewise systematic. And then when a person has an awakening, like that whole category of error tends to get fixed. And then you know how to fix all the different other manifestations of that same category of error.
It makes sense why we see patterns then in adults with the awakening stuff, why this is it's so common, and you just see it over and over again. Like Heather's just been able to demonstrate a lot of it for us in the last few months, and it's just like, it's really encouraging for everyone to see like either themselves in you, Heather, or just to start noticing that pattern. It's been awesome, actually.
There's also something too here that I think is interesting. First time I'd actually seen it this way. The context for the conversation actually makes a lot of sense, but something about the way that we view capitalism and finances and monetary wealth induces us to a kind of framing error that we think more money is better all the time. And so it's kind of the same thing as seeing the space between the candies as more candy, good. It's for the child, it's that kind of framing. For us, it's no, there actually is more, but it doesn't give you the more that you're actually looking for, right?
Yeah.
This is more in a bank account sense, but it doesn't have the richness of my experience that I'm actually looking for.
That's a that's a funny analogy, but I think it works.
It's a good place to bring that in as just a contemplation, because I think for me, and probably a lot of people on the call, a lot of the people that are watching this, the tendency is to think, no, that really is better. In the same way that the 5-year-old might think, no, there really is more candy.
It's sort of like confusing being and having mode, right? It's confusing candy and space. Yeah.
You know what comes up for me on that one though is just thinking about how many people live on or below the poverty line and how large that demographic is, and how it's nearly impossible to make anything else relevant or salient to a person who's stuck in that position. And really the question is like, once you've gone past that, at what point can you start the reflection work? And I think a lot of our economic models tie people in where it's like, this is how I'm surviving now. This is how I'm always going to survive. So I need to maintain this thing, the job, whatever. And the only place I've seen that ability to reflect after success has been through like lifestyle business or entrepreneurship, where passive income is focused on. And then you see that over and over again, because we've seen that so much in our travels, how people will succeed in whatever measure they've set as a goal, and then have a lot of time suddenly to do reflection work, and then fall into a deep existential crisis when they recognize that goal that they had, beyond just their own safety and ability to live, doesn't provide anything additional. No happiness, happy. No meaning. Yeah. So,
right, and that's kind of the thing that's interesting, is the noticing that, you know, the study that I've seen is in the United States anyway, an income of about $70,000. If you're less than that, you're struggling. If you're more than that, you're comfortable, but you think more is better still.
Yeah.
So the billionaires still think another billion, that'll really secure me. But I'm really not capable right now, and it's really not adding to well-being at that point. And the curiosity that I have is, I wonder if it's possible to even lower that so that it's not $70,000 as the basis for well-being, but something more like $35,000. Is it possible to make it so that it's that the amount that takes to well-being, and then you can get to the growth mode, helping people transition from, okay, you've got the lower part of the pyramid taken care of. Now let's go into that existential crisis mindfully and notice that this is no longer actual physical survival, but it's now existential survival, which is a very different kind of a mode of operating.
I have a thought here, if I may. I'm thinking about the higher states of consciousness, and you mentioned now psychedelics. I've never used it, so the closest I've been is coffee, I think. So, but it's a mix between, because I don't think it's a coincidence that Steve Taylor's book is called Waking from Sleep, and it is as if we are sleeping now, even now, when we have this intelligent discussion. But I'm wondering, and I can use a metaphor maybe, because I've been thinking about this, that let's say we leave the mundane gray life and go on a summer holiday to Bulgaria. And the weather is nice, the awesome wine, great sex, everything is like, and then there's a plane home. And you know, it lingers, the feeling and the insights and all the awesomeness, but then it kind of fades away. So psychedelics, I guess, is one way to keep. I don't know, but please say if it does. But there must be other ways to keep us grounded in the mundane life where we actually spend a lot of our time. So what do you think? It's one thing to highlight and say that the real life and the good life and which we sometimes bump into depending on the methods, but we should bring that home as well and make it part of our daily lives. Do you have any tips?
Well, something about the insight cascade makes relevant to you what is not working in your life back home. So hopefully that will inspire some change. If it's not that powerful of a realization, then the action taken from it might not be powerful either. But I think that should be, as far as like changing the physical world, that should be the relevant thing. Like, what is not working? I think, anyway.
Yeah, and the point that Vervaeke makes is not that the altered state of consciousness is more real so that you keep wanting to come back to it like an addict. That's not the point at all. The point is that it transforms how your cognition works. So that after you come out of it, even though you are back to your mundane life, the way that you see the world, the way that you see yourself, the way that you understand things is simply not the same anymore. So it produces the transformation because you're not the same person coming out of it, basically. Yeah. So it's not about the state, it's about the process.
There could also be very physical or I don't know, habit-based things that are kind of screwing up the progress. Like, you know, a heavy career and a lot of responsibilities and children and all of that stuff will definitely keep you glued into a certain way of thinking until you can at least free up some time. So I think the time freedom is a big thing. But I found that, like, my most stunted periods of personal and spiritual development came when I was more focused on money because I didn't have enough of it to survive. So I couldn't do anything else other than sell my labor. So if you're just perpetually stuck in that, then there's very little that can be done. And I think that is a time to really just focus on the material and get out of that situation. But if you've got a degree of freedom of time and then you go out and get those experiences, then you can apply it to your life. Hopefully, if you've got a system and a right amount of motivation to do it.
I think a part of it is that having a really transformative experience actually makes you look at your life in a different way, so that you see the parts that can be transformed that you didn't necessarily see before. Like, it's like, you know, a fish in water. Like, you don't realize what's around you, you don't realize how it's affecting you, but then when you're out of it, you kind of get this, like, from, you know, outside an elevated perspective, like, oh, actually, if I change this and this and this and this, and these things didn't even like pop out at me before, but now I see them, then it'll make my life better. So
you're more conscious. What this reminded me of is I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, maybe not that long ago, there was a camera invented, and they applied for a patent, and I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was a technology that where the camera would take all of the information in its view.
Hey, John.
Little parts of the yes.
Are you able to get closer to your router? You're cutting out a bit there. I don't know if that's going to improve anything, but
I will try and.
I think you were talking about the that
Lytro camera.
That's it. Oh, I was thinking LifeX, but Lytro, yeah. I wanted to get one of those. It's so cool. You can change the focus of it after.
Right, where you take a photograph, and you might focus on, you know, an object, but the camera would take the entire field of view, so you could returns to it and refocus it and look at it in a different way, or different things in the camera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're. I think we got that, but your connection is pretty bad
still
there.
Bad connection.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's choppy. I think that's real. That notion is really interesting, and it's also I think it's interesting as well to think about the fact that it's tempting to think that if psychedelics is what tips you over, that's like, oh my God, this is the answer. Everybody should do psychedelics. Or if it's Christianity, oh my God, this is amazing. Everybody should do this. But it's I think there are two components that are important to recognize. One is the readiness of you as a person. What are you ready for this kind of awakening experience which tips you over? And then what is the specific kind of experience that does make sense for you? And it's something that I think is becoming people are becoming increasingly aware of. And a practice-based life gives a greater likelihood that you'll find the things that are working for you. So it's an interesting notion. It would be, but it's also careful to be aware that the tendency to think that it's either a particular substance or a particular guru who has the magic. The awakening is in me. The potential for awakening is in me, and some external circumstances can help tip me over that point, but that isn't. They're not giving it to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's almost like the shift from, what did he say? From content to within consciousness. The shift in consciousness. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but related to the actual instigator, which could be psychedelics or meditation. Yeah, people get caught up between like the tool for opening that insight and then the content. And that's, for me, that's incredibly useful, especially in describing this stuff.
Or not even the content, because the content doesn't matter again.
Well, it's the same thing as coming.
Transformation that matters.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, essentially. It's like people come out having this experience of oneness and then think they're, Christ, reincarnated or something. And that's the content. That's a content problem.
Yeah. I'm going to share in the chat actually an article with you guys that I saw recently that is relevant to this and very interesting. It's called "Awakening is Not a Path for the Faint of Heart." So it's like a lot of people hear about awakening. They're like, yeah, I'd love to have one, but they don't realize how destructive it is and how difficult it is, because it like completely mangles your whole way of seeing the world and seeing yourself. And it's like, people want a transformation, but when they get it, they don't realize how challenging it actually is. So.
Sorry. It can make you, for example, alone for a while also, because you're breaking off from what you're used to, the people you're used to, the situations you hang around, everything. I've been there this year, for example, and doing a lot of work on myself. I'm not saying I'm succeeding, but I'm at least here. But that it changes. It's like you say, it's not simple. It's not just divine light shining on you and then you're done. And I think that's why many just avoid it too. The whole society is just surrounding us with all these quick fixes and bullshit, and so it should be so easy, just 5 steps away.
Yeah, you're 1 weekend retreat away.
yeah. Then you're done.
Yeah. I would. The thing that comes to mind is the red pill is not a daily vitamin. It's also.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was also going to say, also with the Alexander this morning, that the awareness that the Matrix trilogy and that model is kind of interesting, because, again, back to the participatory knowing, that we operate from a propositional layer of knowing, that high level sense of, oh, it does seem like it's content. But when Neo actually awakens from the machine and comes to life, Morpheus explains to him, oh, you're having a rough time because you've never used your muscles before. you actually don't have true participatory knowing. So you're going to have to boot up and learn all of this stuff. And there's something about that that's really powerful, especially given how much of a person's average person's life these days is in front of a keyboard. We're not using our bodies in the way that we used to. We're increasingly becoming shells of beings that are operating very heavily in the propositional layer. And this waking up of, oh yeah, use your body again. You really need to, there's a lot of intelligence here that you can't access if you don't fully use that red pill to learn what there is inside.
Mm-hmm.
Which, it comes back to what we were saying before about requiring a certain level of privilege just to get to the kind of experiences that can trigger this. But then once you're there, to be able to navigate through them and deal with them, you also need a lot of space. So there's such an inequality of opportunity for this development. Like as children, we pretty much just develop into adults. Some of those developments are smooth, some of them are bumpy, but we all get there. But with this, you need space, and to have that space, you need money, and to have money in the society, you need privilege. And so if we can do this, we're very lucky, but we almost need like developmental scholarships so that people can take a couple of years out of their life and go and do what they need to do, because most people don't have the space to do it, or they have to do it around everything else, which makes it way, way more difficult for themselves and for everyone else involved.
You know what? I definitely, I understand where you're coming from with that, but I definitely disagree, because for some people it's that trauma, it's the giant trauma experience that makes it a necessity to move out of that, and nothing else matters at that point. It's like, you can lose your job, you can be homeless, you can do all of this stuff, and that actually can provide the simplicity in your life. It's like, if all you have to worry about is making sure you get the meal in the day, then I think there's a lot more space for this stuff. It's actually us in the West who struggle the most with this stuff because of the demands of the social environment. How much
think we need all this
stuff.
stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, if all you were worried about is your meals, you'd go to a soup kitchen, or we have those things.
In a lot of Eastern cultures, that function was provided by the ashram, and people just had the option of going into monkhood. And even if they had a family, they could just take a couple years out of their life and become a monk and do this work. And it's considered completely normal. And in places like Thailand, for example, every adult man has to spend at least a couple months as a monk. That's a rite of passage almost into being an adult. So I think it's just the Western societies are really stunted in this way. We don't have these kinds of containers. Monasteries are not really a common thing in Western societies anymore.
And we also, from that kind of Protestant productivity mindset, we really shun the time that people would need to spend to do this.
Taking time off is considered, you're just going to be useless for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, for the West, universal basic income would be a way to, it would basically just open it up to more people.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of value in the struggle, but there are a small number of people who are either willing or able to take it. And if there was a little bit better foundation underneath more people, then maybe it would open it up.
Yeah.
And I think that having actually proper containers for this kind of work is helpful, like properly functioning monasteries,
It is actually one reason why a lot of monasteries that you can find, I think ones that do, Hindu ashrams in the States and Canada, or in the West, I would say, also give away free meals. So you can come there and meditate and eat, and they give away that food. And it's like the monastic setting where you can do that work. And they make sure that your one set of needs, a place to sleep and something to eat, are taken care of.
Yeah, there are a lot of places that will offer that for free. Actually, like many years ago when
Actually, we did that too.
Yeah, when
Yeah,
we
when
were really struggling financially, we would go to the Hindu temple every week and get their free meal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Guys, if you wouldn't mind, just rewinding a little bit to John Vervaeke's, what he was talking about, the machinery of attention. And John has this amazing way of explaining things where he kind of puts things into context. Like when he talks about use of psychedelics, he talks about embedding it into an ecology of practices. And I think it's actually trying to figure out what that ecology looks like for oneself, so that when you have these transformative experiences, when you have these wake-up experiences, you're able to look at your own cognitive machinery and that sense of self or your beingness in relation to these layers of understanding the world or seeing the world. And I think, you know, what I see a lot of this work pointing to is trying to figure out in groups how to wake up to Plato's shadows in the caves and help each other kind of guide each other to more and more towards a path of freedom or a path of waking up. And yeah, it's an interesting journey listening to these conversations and from different places around the world and seeing that this is universal. It doesn't relate to South Africa or America. It's common to humanity, these kind of stages of awakening. And I'm hoping somehow in this group and others to kind of figure out how to, and also in the Future Thinkers course, how to kind of create an ecology of practices that help create the structures to create a bit more of a permanent awakening state that functions in the world, and then perhaps also technologies that come from people that are waking up as well, as we sort of help pull each other out of the cave and shine the light and show up where we're bullshitting ourselves. There's no question in here. I kind of wanted to rewind as we were going further and go, wait, I was actually meant to talk about this while it was relevant. But I'm hoping that we can help each other figure out how to create an ecology of practices. You know, almost like the Ken Wilber wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up. You know, it's almost becomes a structure of like, have we got all the right components that make up an awakened process?
Mm-hmm. A lot of these are actually talked about in the courses. Like, I don't know how far into the courses you are, but if you go through both of them, all of those 4 things are covered. At least like the kind of the primary practices for wake up, grow up, show up, clean up. Yeah. And the groups are more for, definitely kind of pointing out each other's blind spots, but a lot of it is just for practice. Like, how do we show up with each other? How do we actually participate with other people? Because it's it can be easy to deceive ourselves if we're just sitting in a room or in a cave by ourselves staring at a wall. But then the real litmus test is, how do we show up in the world? So that's what the groups are for. But a lot of those practices are highly individual. Like, it's not possible to do all those things in a group or just rely on a group to do the work for you. So.
Can I get a confirmation from the chat that you guys are seeing this again? Someone was saying it was lagging really hard. Yeah. So
works really fine.
Okay.
I had a thought that, as we were talking about the monastic places where monastic culture is embraced in the West, it's really not. There's a thought that comes to mind, and also the discussion about having people's basic needs met, the distinction of privilege and not, and all of that. There's something that comes to mind. There's sort of two ends of the spectrum that seem like they might be problematic, and a middle ground that I think addresses Alexander's point. One is we don't want monasteries to become homeless shelters, right?
Yeah.
We don't want it to just be someplace where people just show up for the soup and that's it. And you can watch for that, but you do want access for that, and for people to know that what they're engaged in is work, right? That in a sense, I love this notion. There's a book called The Healing Organization, and I've heard the example of, I don't remember the name of it, a bakery in New York City in the Bronx that works to make access available for people, for anyone who applies. Their application process is put your name on the waiting list. When we have an availability and you're next on the waiting list, you'll be called and you're brought in and you're given training, and here's the way it works and here's the expectation. And if you can't meet that, then you won't continue. If you can meet it, and if you can an acceptable level of effort and trying and making that work, and there's a lot of leniency for growing you into that position, then you will stay. But if you can't, you can put yourself back on the end of the line and come back again. But it makes it so that when people get there, they really cherish that opportunity. People who come in on drugs and living under a bridge and like, I don't have anything, all of a sudden will clean themselves up. They'll have the motivation to, yes, I'm going to make the most of this opportunity, not because it's free and freely available. There's still is a kind of a scarcity, but there's not a barrier to entry other than, embracing that scarcity. The other side of it, I think, is being mindful of the fact that we don't want, the notion of, in some sense, I think WeWork started to look a little bit like a utopic vision of entrepreneurial kindergarten. For the rest of your life, you get to just have courses and workspaces and free lattes, and it's just like, oh, this is going to be super awesome. And then it's like, wait a minute, that doesn't quite work either. There's something of the high end of that, of recognizing there's some ability to show up and share of myself as well. So I'm curious. I mean, this is kind of my thought in the ecology of practices. I don't think that there is one size fits all, or getting too fixed on branding for what's the specific kind of thing that's most effective. It's really the ecology of practices is, how do I find when I'm ready and what's most appropriate for me. And I would imagine in that ecology of practices, having more of a capacity for people to meet and be able to say, okay, hey, there's where I'm running into challenges. And oh, that sounds like what you could use is a little more, whatever, one kind of practice or another, right? Depending on where you're at and what kind of problems you're running into.
I found that in my own path, there was, like Heather has talked about, a cascade of insights. For me, it was like cascade of sort of like directives almost. Like I became more and more self-guided as I was going through my own internal work, to the point where just things that I needed to learn or things that I needed to practice revealed themselves to me. And as that happened more and more, I began to trust it more and more, and follow it and actually do the work as it presented itself, and it snowballed. So I think kind of tapping into that self-guided process, like what is actually working for me, what do I need to learn, what do I need to practice, what do I need to ditch, and really tapping into that internal sense is the most useful thing, rather than trying to find some sort of template or external guidance.
It's why it's been the same for me. And totally the same. And it's why meditation has been so useful. And I think it's that a piece that people don't really understand if they haven't meditated a whole lot, is that the failure of meditation, like when the thoughts are running through, is also the success of meditation. It's like when those thoughts are running through, it's providing you that stream of what you can work on, opportunities.
Yeah.
Like things you're worried about, or whatever thoughts come in, or maybe it's just your lack of focus. Maybe it's just like you're thinking of, what's on TV later. Like any of those things can be, as soon as you pay attention to them through the process of meditating, when you watch those thoughts come through, that becomes your to-do list.
Yeah, exactly. Or like any kind of recurring unpleasant emotions.
Yeah.
Like anger coming up. Okay, well, there we go. There's my to-do list. That's what I need to work on.
Yeah. And then, I mean, that can inform what you Google as well. It's like, okay, if I'm noticing I have a lot of anxiety in the body, and then, maybe I need to pick up some books on it, dealing with that. And then you'll inevitably learn practices and find communities and stuff. You're muted, Heather.
Is that okay?
All right.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say just quickly, the Vervaeke in a previous episode when he talked about the golden mean, I think, where you're finding sort of a point from which to navigate rather than being so focused on all the stuff, is focusing on how do I get that centered, a little bit like, but what both Mike and Yubi were talking about. How do I get centered in myself so that what I need to know becomes apparent to me. And somehow it has to do with participating fully in yourself. And I think that's maybe a starting point for releasing some of those answers.
Yeah, participating fully in yourself is actually a really good way to put it. In some shamanic practices, it's called self-possession, when you're inhabiting yourself fully.
It's interesting, the getting your hands on the controls of relevance realization, how that's not an end point, but more of a starting point.
Yeah.
For the self-guided stuff. It's like, as soon as you're able to figure out what is relevant, and at least like that's what the trauma's first, I think, really.
Yeah.
Because the trauma hijacks relevance realization. As soon as you can get to some sort of state where you're not being hijacked by your emotions and by your trauma, then you can start to, open up the landscape and then move from there. But I think that's the starting point, and that's done through both trauma work and meditation. And then the rest of it, I think is quite, we have so much information available, but if you allow yourself to be self-guided in that, once you've got a bit of control over relevance realization, then the process unravels on its own.
Yeah, the path just reveals itself.
Yeah.
And it's different for every person. Like, it's such an internal process.
Yeah, which is why giving an ecology of practices might, I think it's useful as like a menu, a tool set, a menu. Yeah, it's useful in that way, but it's not necessarily relevant to people exactly where they are.
Yeah, I think you mentioned like a tool belt, so it's kind of like these are the array of practices. It's going to be different for different people, and different people are going to be stuck in different areas. Some are stuck in a trauma, some are stuck, I personally was stuck in a sort of like what John was talking about in this lecture now, having this this awakened experience, and then trying to make sense of the day-to-day realm, or what now seems like the waking dream. and then now having seen his John talking about this zooming in and zooming out, suddenly there's now a structure, like a structure to become aware of the fact that you zoom far out, and actually in order to find that golden mean again is to actually zoom right in and then zoom out again and try and find out where one exists on this, or not exists, but where is that golden meme of where you find yourself present and realizing, oh, this is what I need to do next. Hey, Heather.
That resonates with me for sure. Yeah, it's finding, you're right. It's participating fully in yourself, situated in the fullness of the moving in and out, in the point from which it is equally possible to move in both directions. I think is where the magic is. And I'm not there. I'm playing around with this idea, but I think that's I don't want to say it's an end state either, but it's something to feel around for me, I think.
I think a lot of us sell our own experience and guidance systems short. And even what you just said there, Heather, like I think you know, I mean, you've demonstrated a lot for months now, that you know the direction and what you need to work on, and that you're self-directed at this point. And it seems that we just kind of get out of touch with that ability to check in with yourself and just ask that question, like, what do I need? What is the big thing missing? Or what do I need to do? Or what's next? Like we're in that stuck place. Is just to have the wherewithal, the consciousness to just check in and then trust the answer.
I think that's really hard to do in a corporate environment on a daily basis, for real. I would hope I would do it a lot more often, but it's so stressful. So you need, I at least need some place and time and methods to just bring me to that, you know, okay, where am I now? What's next? And one thing, I tend to work with knowledge management and other stuff, but he talks about the higher states of consciousness, and I realize this now, that they don't bring any new knowledge, and knowledge is so praised. It's like the more knowledge you hoard, the better you are, and that's not true. But many people can look at it but it's instead wisdom that transforms our existential mode. So I think basically we need shamans in the corporate world as well. And often the people who are the modern shamans, they can do that kind of flight over what people are discussing on a day-to-day basis. I know I'm maybe off track here, but I think well, the people I hang around with, they talk a lot about knowledge and knowing stuff, but it's wisdom that we are aiming for here. So I'm glad I'm joining this group.
You know, the shaman thing, needing the shaman or the guru thing is that's a real challenging one, because part of the nature of doing this work, and if someone's able to be a shaman or be helpful to others, they also have the ability to do a lot of harm, because the nature of doing this work is you understand what motivates people and what drives people and what they secretly want on the inside and what they telegraph to other people. You can see through a lot of that stuff, and it becomes extremely dangerous if that person attempting to teach hasn't done the work all the way through as well, because then they start seeing the opportunity to manipulate people. So like, I'm very hesitant about, especially in corporate environments, to have anything like that, you know?
Yeah. I hear you.
Yeah, because corporations are so focused on profit. And if this kind of person comes into that structure, then they're going to be inserted into that landscape of incentives. So, and that can be really, really toxic. I mean, that's when you get these like corporate cults, basically. So
it is interesting. Is there's an aspect of this that I've been thinking about a lot, because Patrick, I have the same sense, and if you're not familiar, you sound like you may be with being a knowledge manager. You may be familiar with Robert Keegan and his book An Everyone Culture, and there's something very inspirational about looking at that from deep developmental work included in the workplace. In a way, it almost has to be already part of the culture. I think the challenges of bringing this in, for both of the reasons that we just mentioned. One, it can completely disrupt the status quo and cause you to derail. And two is the kinds of ways in which it can be subverted for personal gain. But I do think that there's an interesting notion here. I've been toying a lot with the idea of an alternative mode of organization, and this is one of the ideas that's come to mind a lot lately, is an idea of like a network of cooperative ventures that are that do incorporate from the ground up that notion of growth and the shamanistic part of it, so that it's as transparent as necessary to make sure that there isn't that kind of derailing or the bringing attention to the kind of problem areas that are there. And I think it's something that's that actually ties pretty closely to this notion of an ecology of practices as well. I think that we're getting to a point where there is an opportunity for us to have the kind of checks and balances, senses of responsiveness and accountabilities between practitioners and corporations needing that, or some other model of doing that where we can explore and sort of start to go down that path and see if there's something that's happening. In a way, start to really engage in true collective practices of awakening, which is that's one of the things that's very keen out there, and it's a real good reason to bone up on your cult dynamics and make sure that you know what the challenges are.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, I never would have thought when I was younger that cults would be a relevant thing in my future. But they are. Oh man. It's
in any time of transformation that becomes a relevant thing, and we're going through a time of transformation. So people's sense of reality, people's sense of having their needs met, a lot of things are disrupted, and cults tend to capitalize on people's confusion. So that's why they're becoming relevant again. But it's like anytime there's a time of transformation in human history, there's always been cults. So it's not a new thing.
I feel like, though, oh, go ahead, John.
I was just saying, I was listening to, I think it's Emerge, the podcast. Yep. They were talking about the mindfulness being, how it's been adapted and accepted in, I think, NIH, I guess the government, the UK government, and how that's been a, I don't know, 10 or 20 year long sort of process where it's even paid for now. And so that's kind of an example, I guess, of a corporate inclusion or acceptance of this. And it's a very slow, kind of gentle way to get into it, but that's probably pretty viable way to do things like that in a corporate environment.
What David said about the culture needing to already be there, there's something interesting about that, because it's like, if the environment really needs the culture, then the environment also kind of depends on people not having that culture for it to continue. So it's like self-destructive to install anything like this. In some environments, I wouldn't say all. I do think there's, at the foundation, there needs to be this mindset already there, or part of the culture.
Yeah, maybe kind of seeds of it, because the culture is also made up of people participating in it, and so people create the culture, and the culture informs how people interact. And
I shouldn't make such a statement either like that. I'm just thinking out loud.
It's a feedback cycle, but yeah, I think the seeds need to be there. Either the internal desire of the people who come together in an organization, internal desire for transformation, for creating something new, whatever that may be. Yeah. So not necessarily the culture being there, but kind of the generator functions of culture, if you will.
Also, the awareness. The other thing that I think is really refreshing to have Vervaeke bring back to our awareness is the propensity to bullshit ourselves, and the way in which we can recognize, and if we can get trained on that, and be able to speak forward and say, "Hey, you know what? We're doing this, but wait a minute, I smell BS." There's either we think we've solved some problem and we're golden for the rest of our lives, or we're able to avoid pain. It's like, nope, hold on a second. If I was just telling someone else, if you there's a thought that a lot of people hear this, and a lot of companies hear this and say, oh, we just think it's kumbaya and a lot of hugs and warm feelings, a little meditation in the morning, it's going to be nice. I say, oh no, this is confronting shadow. If you're not sweating, you're not doing a workout. And the recognition of embracing that is it's a challenge.
Yeah.
I do think there's something beautiful though about this notion of something like, I mentioned it in the thread in the comments during the Vervaeke talk, of being able to compost our failures, being able to step out beyond the zone of safety, but have an ability to recover from that and not have it be a catastrophic failure, or not to have failures be an albatross we hang around someone's neck, or something that we bury in the landfill. We really want to make sure to get the most gold out of every venture that fails. What did we learn from this? What is the meta learning opportunity in this? And it's difficult with the way that corporations are structured right now. Even if we were bringing these practices in, there still is a tendency of, oh, but if the corporation goes down, that's it, we melt.
Yeah.
And that's possible not to avoid that to some extent in the cooperative network of ventures, right? We can experiment and sort of not be completely at the mercy of that, but also not saying we're going to just give you infinite lives, right? Hey, we've rebooted this 3 times or whatever. Maybe it's time to let this one die and give something else a chance to grow. Again, very rough sketches of a possibility space that's beyond the traditional corporate structure, but interesting to think about playing around with. Something in the game sphere. We talked a little bit about the gaming. I like the idea of creating some sort of gamification of this in a way that allows us to be more deeply exploratory and wisdom tradition creating.
I like what Google had done with the I don't know if they still do it with the kind of free time projects for engineers. I also like the idea of 30 or 20 hour work weeks instead of 40 to 60. I mean, just providing a set of courses or lectures and then not having people work to the bone every week could be enough in this corporate environment.
I like that too. The one thing that I'd say about Google that concerns me is that it doesn't matter the venture, it's still owned by Google. You have 20% work, that's great. Okay, thank you. Send it to Papa. There we go. Nice.
Send it to Papa. Yeah.
I mean, there's a real interesting way that in this model, I in something like this, I envision whether it's reduced work week or that venture being successful, how does that enrich the commons to allow more kind of exploratory type stuff to happen, rather than simply bringing it all home again. And this is interesting because I think that there's something here that really speaks to a possibility. I think, okay, here's the thought. Back to the notion that the kindergarten notion of capitalism is that if I get more money, it's better. And that's not really recognizing the space of that. One of the corollary notions in there is intellectual property law is good. Because there's something about that has a protectionism mechanism that makes me be able to hoard more of the money. And so there are several of these parts that are fitting together. I'm not saying there's a magic wand that I can wave and make all that go away, but there is something in the exploratory nature of what's the meta learning that can happen around this systemic failure, around the mindset that causes us to lock into a mode that's not, what's the word? Not really focused more on growth than it is on profit or something like that. Really, again, back to the point we made before, balancing that, really finding the personal setting on the noise to signal ratio that allows me to explore the fringes more and find out what's out there. And it seems like right now we're at a point where the capacity for some people to have enough safety rope to explore the fringes is a good idea.
Yeah.
Given fragility of the institutions as they are, if we just rely on existing institutional models are great, let's just double down on that. It's like, I don't think that's going to go well.
Yeah.
I feel really.
Go ahead.
I'm really uncomfortable with the idea, both of the sort of the ashrams are going to provide us a way to get there, not because they aren't great, that isn't a great place and a great way to do that, but what about the Catholic Church and the Jehovah Witnesses and all the other sort of places that people could end up and same thing with corporations. You know, you might have a corporation that's awake and can provide that, but most of them that's not what they're thinking about. That's not what their interests are. And the same thing with the religions, I guess. I'm going to say ashrams because you mentioned it, but basically religions. That to me is really, I don't know, dangerous, scary.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Mm.
definitely. But I mean, if we're trying to think of what are the existing institutions or institutions of the past that can fulfill this kind of need, and then trying to think about, okay, what's the better version that we can do in the future? Like maybe we just don't have a term for it yet. But yeah, like properly functioning monastery, when I think about it, wouldn't be the same as a Catholic monastery. It would be, you know, then it's difficult to say that it wouldn't be about indoctrination into a religion, because like what for most people running it, what would the motivation be? And you know, even if we look at my example of the Thai monasteries, I don't know how many of those people are waking up.
Yeah.
Probably not many.
Yeah.
It is a different moment, I think. And the kinds of monastic practices in the past, I mean, I think it's why it's interesting, you know, John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall just had the conversation on the religion that's not a religion. I'm trying to design what that is. And it's really fascinating, not only the breadth at which they're thinking, but also the polarity of the people in the comment section about, oh, this is wonderful, and oh my God, this is terrible. But I think that an aspect of this, John, that I think you're bringing to light that I agree with, is there's a need for a degree of transparency, a degree of radical transparency about what actually is happening, in order to really know, are these organizations really doing what we expect them to do, and both on the corporate side and on the religious side, right?
There's a reason there's such a deep and personal relationship with the student and the guru, and that is because there is so much personal content, and there's so much risk in handing your development over to someone and have them kind of tell you which direction to go. And in some cases it's good, in some cases it's not good. There's abuse, and then there is people who are really legitimately trying to help. But the notion of having the entire developmental process, I'm not saying that you said this, but have the entire thing be transparent is quite difficult. And I know there are large sections of my own personal development that I would never want to be transparent as a student. And then also as someone who's like starting to teach this stuff as well, I still feel like some of that is not, you know,
yeah, there's
not able to be transparent.
Certain corners of shadow work that are not meant for public transparency. Like it's something that you do by yourself and maybe just share with like one or two people that you really trust. But it's like, it's just such the corners of the human mind, you know. There be monsters.
There's something as well, and this is just a thought, and I don't know. I've never really tested it, but there's something about the context of what is being shown if someone's like helping and directing people through. There's something about that. Like say someone's going through some sort of deep trauma and has beliefs about that trauma and the nature of that trauma. Like sometimes the exercise that you would have them go through would be horrific and wrong and appear to be the completely like antithetical thing that you should do in that environment, but it's exactly what they need to do, like exposure therapy to an extreme. And that exists, and I've seen that happen where it's like, ooh, that, you know, what that suggestion is to deal with this trauma or fix this problem, people can't hear that. People can't see that. And that would be a terrible thing to be transparent.
I agree. So transparent for me, I mean something different than public. And so there's something in the notion of this that I think is important, because if it is truly just between the student and the teacher, then the kinds of problems that we run into with abuse are going to be rampant. We're not going to be able to catch those. And so there needs to be some kind of enough transparency to have accountability. And that's, and it can't be, this is the thing that's interesting. I don't think it can be a rules-based approach. It has to be, well, I love the Forrest Landry conversation recently, where you distinguish between rules and principles, between ethics and morality, where ethics is more principle based and is more subjective, inward out, right, from the inside out, rather than, so like the golden rule versus outside in, the 10 commandments, right? Which is, it's an interesting model, and I think we're going to run into that. It's the reason that I think that you can't necessarily say, here's the definitive rules, here's the definitive characteristics of a cult, and if you have these, you're a cult, and if you don't, then you're not. It's interesting. I agree that there's a challenge to that, and acknowledge that you don't want to just say, oh yeah, no privacy, everything's open, everybody can see everything. But there also has to be some
need it's clear that there's a need for new institutions, new structures, and I don't know, my gut says that one, I'm not sure what they are, how it would work, but my gut says smaller is what's needed. Maybe, I have this picture of like the geodesic dome, where it's all really strong as a big, each little panel is, separate, and it's a big, strong thing together. And so it seems to me, because it's different for lots, everybody's got different needs, different cultures have different needs. And so I don't know that there's one sort of solution. And it seems like in the world we live in today, the growth, everything's bigger, and that's part of the problem, is that I think we need some smaller institutions.
I really love the idea of that saying, that the next Buddha will be a Sangha. The next Buddha will be a large group of, or not a large, but a group of students.
Group of practitioners.
Yeah, practitioner. Thank you. And at the same level as what we're like, the size of the groups that we have here and on the course calls, I think that's a way that everyone can like practice and discuss shadow work, and then keep each other in check, and like have a reflection mechanism between all of us. So I think, I don't know, we're testing just like a lot of other people are, but I'm really liking the direction of what we're doing in this
smaller groups.
Yeah, I think that's, if I had to pick a model, I would think that's the one I've picked anyway. I really like it.
And I would say that there's something like fractal holographic, right?
Yeah.
The scaling factor and the ability to sense dissonance, even if I don't know specifics, right? The fact that there's something, some activity level within a node is like, oh, that's interesting. Hey, do y'all need, are y'all running into problems? I don't know. It's a mental model that I don't have fleshed out, but some sense of within this fractal scaling within the network of practitioners and these and these sanghas, is noticing that sanghas aren't isolated either, right? So they
right. Yeah. Like a sangha.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
There's something also about, I think, in the individual, moving away from the teacher student or guru model towards like a guide and mentor toolbox model. So like, for example, for myself, I'm on your group calls. Those have been wonderful guidance, but I've also talked to Michael Taft, who's like a secular meditation coach. And I also have a counselor who has experience in this area. So I have a number of different sources who can advise me and help me, and I can check those against each other. And one of them will notice if I take on something from another that is sending me in the wrong direction, because I have these kind of different orbiting checks around me. And I think that speaks to John's idea of going small. That's exactly it. It's like each person finding the little micro resources that resource them specifically, and then using them in a specific way that creates this safety net to keep them within the right directionality.
You just described a blockchain of spiritual development, like distributed, immutable, decentralized. What was the other one? I had like 4 more flash through my head as you were talking. Yeah.
It's the future.
Yeah.
Nice.
And I would say holochain, not blockchain, but just
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A hole-on. That's what we need. Hole-ons. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that's
what I was
happening in the
visualizing.
bigger organizations as well, with distributed cognition. Because many people I hang around, they work in companies that are unimaginably big, like 150,000 people. I don't know what they do, but that's so it's, for me, it's not either or. But either you just work in small teams in your company, because we do that as well. But to solve these huge problems, we distribute the cognition and build this, no matter what we it's almost like therapy sessions where we open up and talk about all the issues, and it quickly becomes apparent that no matter if you're in a company with 150,000 people or 10,000 or 5, you face the same issues and the same fears and the same doubts and then we can share, tools and methods and support, and just to move on with things. So I don't think it's either or. The huge corporations will probably be around for a long time. So it's worth doing, but it's hard, yes, and always starts in the individual.
It's about the nested holons, like nested groups within groups within groups, and the groups interfacing with each other. Yeah. Well,
it's also interesting. Again, I'm amazed at how much of this conversation was kind of prefaced with Alexander in my conversation this morning a couple of hours ago. But that sense of just that, the membrane is where the intelligence is, and something of a holographic membrane really does know, is this, the reason that I love holochain so much is because it recognizes that there isn't in the body, right? The cells in a body naturally congeal into organs and systems that have a kind of relevance realization. Is this a systemic whole body issue, or is this a local issue? And so you don't need to occupy the whole body's intelligence. If I make everything go through the central processor, then it's going to be bogged down and not be able to respond to everything that's necessary. But at the same time, if everything's just decentralized and out there and doesn't have the capacity to come up to global awareness, then I'm also going to run into a problem. Oh, hey, this is something everybody's suffering from. And right now, with the existing models of corporate structure and secular involvement, there isn't a way to scale up holographically and scale down holographically. And so the beautiful part of looking at John Vervaeke's stuff and looking at the relevance realization is, can we build technology that helps us be able to guide that relevance realization, not to do it for us, but kind of a telescope of zooming on the social level to notice, where do I fit? What's needed from me? How do I get my needs met?
That relates to Anna's comment in the chat. She said Vervaeke was talking about perception. What's your thoughts on the ways the internet is running now? Personalized search results, algorithms, likes, and ratings, and its impact on our perception. And in my mind, and we've talked about this a lot in previous calls, I think even last week's Vervaeke talk, we brought this up, but I think there's a giant opportunity for services that are built to be agnostic and provide relevance realization services. But it's definitely, we're working against Google and Facebook and all of these algorithms at the moment.
Or
they're working against
us.
They're working against us. Yeah.
You know, I'm.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm getting biomimicry of a scaling up from cells to organs to a system of organs, and you know, doing your personal development work is like working on this on the cell. And if we're doing little group chats like that, we're trying to figure out the relevance realization in a group and coherence like an organ, and then that can then sort of be scaled up again to larger and larger levels of organization. And I think something will pop out of all of this. I think, you know, there was a guy you had on your podcast, Jim Rutt, who was talking about the fifth attractor. And I think it's going to be vital that some way of cohering that is as attractive from the cell to the organs to the body as attractive as the money system is currently attractive, or as attractive as religions was attractive. Another level of organization that will, I don't know what it is, but will start organically to appear. And I think AI is an important part of that, in that organizational structure. You know, that I don't know how it looks, but I was chatting to David today, and I think that, you know, if AI is decentralized, has both a centralized function and a decentralized function, and starts to work on the individual, for the individual, by the individual, programmed by the individual, but can also relate to the whole, to the organs and to the whole body, then there's another type of intelligence starting to be born.
I agree. I think that's going to be an incredibly useful part of our future, is AI mediated human relation.
Well, it's already AI mediated. It's just kind of in its primitive phase, because the algorithms do determine.
It's not really. The relationship is not one-to-one. It's not us to others. It's us to advertisers. That's the AI mediated relationship.
But even on Facebook, you know, whose posts you see is mediated by algorithms. So it does kind of determine, like, oh, these people are relevant or they're friends. And then others, you just never see their posts.
Right.
There is I do notice that tuning it, tuning my usage of social media allows it to serve me better. If I use it in an addictive way, then it's going to serve me more addictive content. If I use it in a mindful way, it serves me more mindful content.
Yeah.
There isn't transparency there, and that's what I would like to see.
Yeah.
Patrick, you had something?
No. That's just reminded me. That's why I use Twitter for and building lists of people. That could be in itself a cognitive bias. Yes, I know. but instead of relying on just algorithms and some computers guessing who I should hang with, LinkedIn and Facebook work the same way. But at least on Twitter, you have the focus. Yeah. You can build your own lists, and for example, so you don't miss anything from the future thinkers or anyone else.
Yeah. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you can fuck off.
And we will send you an email each week.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. There'll be like every year they're going to add another step.
Yeah.
All right. I think we should wrap up.
With the,
yep.
With the platform cooperatives.
No.
Platform cooperativism. It's Trevor Schultz is the guy's name. He's out of a new school in New York that sort of started it. And at some point when Twitter was in big trouble, we were trying to buy it and turn it into a sort of the commons. So there might be a way to, I kind of like the idea of like a repo man, go in and take these things back and then fix them so they work for us. Like you're taking houses or cars or something, they're not working, and at some point we're, buy them dime on the dollar and then use them for better purposes.
Yeah.
I will say as a closing comment that is that idea of platform cooperatives came to me by way of Douglas Rushkoff's book Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. It also gave me the idea that where capitalism is possibly weak right now. So there's a lot of my ideas that around that. I've listened to the book 3 or 4 times because it's such a rich perspective. I don't agree with everything that Doug Rushkoff believes, but I think that his framing of how our economy works and the role of platform cooperatives is a very good introduction to that idea. So for anybody who wants to know more about that.
What was the name?
Douglas Rushkoff is the author. Rushkoff, Rushkoff, and the name of the book is Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus.
That's such a good name.
Yeah,
I love that.
unusual book name. Cool. All right. This has been fun. What are we doing for Christmas? We're gonna take a bit of a break. We haven't decided exactly from when to when, and also for me to have a baby.
Yeah.
Need to do that.
Yeah, you
Make
do
a new human thing.
Do now pretty much. So
any day now.
what I think, and then there's the holidays. I don't know what we're gonna do.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're gonna start it from like next week or if we'll do another one and then take a break until January. You guys will get the email. So
yeah. That's the way to find out is to go to our email list, futurethinkers.org/sign up. Subscribe, hit that bell icon.
And talk about transformative experience to have children.
Yeah.
It's like
game
there's certainly
parenting.
Before and after.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have my 2 kids at home. That's why I'm quiet sometimes and leave. It's like because they need me. So yeah.
I don't know how we're
like
gonna do
with
everything we do with a child in the house.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, you'll see. Yeah.
We will, won't we?
It's not what you think right now. It's
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
Yeah.
Everything you know is wrong.
I have that feeling. Yeah. I have that feeling. All right. See some of you tomorrow. Some of you next week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
For those of you still watching, if you like this content, we do have our courses and memberships. We've discussed that a little bit on this call. And you can check that out at futurethinkers.org/members. There's a weekly membership. You get access to both courses. Monthly membership. Thanks. And you get access to both courses. And they cover cultivating sovereignty and integrating the shadow. And then we also do weekly calls, but that's an additional fee. So see you next week.